Good morning and welcome to the Deloitte Pavilion and welcome to Infrastructure and Transport Day here at COP29. Delighted to be here. My name is Michael Flynn. I'm the Global Leader at Deloitte for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Government. And we've got a great panel here to talk about urban resilience and urban spaces. I think as a background, so urban spaces have that significant impact on sustainability. And the decarbonization of these spaces, either for new build or what's already there, has a significant impact on overall climate levels and decarbonization levels across the board. So from a city perspective, there's huge amounts of impact on that. There's the built environment, there's what's using the use of those infrastructure assets, transport and mobility, and then how you operate cities and whether you can make those more sustainable as you do that. Of course, when you're doing that, you need to consider, what we build. So what's the planning that goes around that and what goes into cities? How we build it. So is there efficient practices? Do we use digital to make the best decisions? The materials we use, so what we build it with. So are we using what's developed to make the new build and the retrofit as decarbonized as we can? How we use the assets, anything that's built. So again, are we using them in a sustainable manner? Are we operating them in a sustainable manner? And then what we do with the existing stock. Can we retrofit that to make that decarbonize that? And then last of all is are we using finance and climate finance to drive those activities and behaviours, both from the financing side, but then also drive the cities to get to that sustainable future. So with all of that, and as we look at cities, we need to operate a bit differently in order to be sustainable. So there needs to be more combined planning. Consider everything in that urban area. It's not just the single asset that you're looking at that particular point in time. How does it knit into the fabric of an urban space? And as you're considering that, you're considering both climate and equity considerations. Is it fair for all? We're seeing the greater use of digital throughout figuring out what you build and how you build it. And then also the operation side. So it's very, very clear that if you don't have digital in terms of when you're looking at your urban spaces, if it's not there, then you're not doing it as efficiently as you can as possible. There's lots of solutions available. Making sure you have sufficient finance and how that layers in from an infrastructure, and that's a key point in this COP. Changing city operations. How do we change that to make sure that we're operating on a sustainable basis? And then changing citizen behaviours. How do we, as a city, drive people to do things more sustainable? Encourage them to use public transit rather than picking the car. And doing those various changes in behaviour that make our cities more sustainable. So there are a few of the points which I'm sure will come up today, but I'm joined by a great panel this morning. Sam Asafa, who's the Director of Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation, Office of the Governor, California. We've got Elaine Doody, who's the Director and leads the city's planning and design practice at Arup. And Michelle Dijkman, who's the Director of Sector Policy at KfW. So great panel and lots of views on some of the points and I'm sure many more that I've raised there. So maybe Sam, I'll start with you. So, as I said, sustainability is an increasingly critical part in terms of urban planning. And so in your experience, both at city and state level, how has sustainability impacted the decision-making that for urban planning and infrastructure development that you've been looking at?
Great, thanks, Michael, and thank you, Deloitte, for this engagement. Coming from an architecture and urban planning background, I have a bias that decisions that you make in the built environment has probably the most impact on climate, on quality of life, and economy. What I've seen in my own profession, living and working in 7 cities, 4 countries, 3 continents. One thing I know is across the globe, humans have not changed that much. All the needs are similar in terms of what they want about the places that they want to be. And what has changed in my profession over the last 25, 30 years is the more and more recognition that the status quo is not acceptable in terms of how we used to build. Los Angeles torn down railroad tracks some 60, 70 years ago because development at that time meant, designing for the car. So the concept that we should design for people has become sort of more and more sort of the everyday thinking now. It did not used to be like that. The Dutch were not cyclists, but for some creative urban planners and designers like Steve Monderman, who was a traffic engineer who realized that many years of designing for the car resulted in completely the opposite of what urban places were intended to do. So that transformation to really think about designing for people was one of the most incredible transformations. What I also know is more and more, literally by the year, by the decade, that new data, new information tells us that we have to collectively think about urban places, not just from an infrastructure perspective, not just from an energy saving perspective, not just from green urban design perspective in terms of not only the building performance, but green spaces, the importance of exposure to nature and its impact on health has to be incorporated into the design. Just 10 years ago, a seminal study that looked at the link between obesity and urban pattern. When I went to school, I did not learn that urban design is going to affect my health. The pattern of design that really does not encourage walking, biking, actually increases obesity. And that was scientifically linked by a study at University of Washington in UW in Washington. So there's so many factors that go into it. Good urban design and urban planning has to incorporate all of that. And then finally, there is a social component to it as well. Climate, sustainability, the impacts of that really impacts disproportionately people who don't have access to great parks, green spaces. Urban heat island, where you lack green space in an urban place, are places where the low-income families live. Well, they're the ones who are most impacted during summer at extreme heat conditions. Oh, by the way, they also pay more for air conditioning because that area is a lot more warmer than any other area if it was designed next to green spaces. So all in all, there's significant amount of issues and considerations that have to be taken as you plan for a sustainable urban planning.
Super, thanks, Sam. It's difficult to imagine years ago that you would have been worrying about our health in California as you started your planning and architectural career, which is good. Lane, moving to technology, and I talked about that if you're not using technology, we're probably not doing it right at this point. So AI, analytics, there's really reshaping how we plan cities, how we construct them and operate them. Can you share some examples of how you've seen technology being used with the sustainability question and solutions that we're looking at?
Yes, thank you very much, and again, delighted to be here. Thanks to Deloitte. And actually to build on Samuel's point around urban heat. So I'll give 2 examples of how we're using technology, including machine learning, to measure the impact of heat and then also the impact of water in cities. And I guess in terms of data and mapping and machine learning, what combining these things allows you to do is to actually then map and demonstrate some of the things that you were just saying in terms of vulnerable people and areas of lower socioeconomic impact having less access to remedies, but also more impact in terms of urban heat in particular. And some of that is due to the types of buildings that we see. So we did a study in London around to produce an urban heat snapshot, and one of the outcomes was that areas which had more higher density of apartment buildings, which is mostly where the type of social housing have, as you said, more impact from heat. The buildings get hotter, and then less access to cooling. So, using those data sets and using this tool, we're able to quickly. So, some of this obviously could be done with armies of people, but this allows us to quickly be able to show to city planners where the vulnerable areas are, and then start to suggest some areas of remediation, including nature-based solutions. Another area is around then sponge cities and water. And again, combining data sets, applying machine learning, and then applying factors such as, the soil type, the propensity for water runoff, we're then able to calculate where areas of flooding might occur. And really what this does is it allows planners and the population at large to understand that nature is a stakeholder in what we're doing, and that nature has a part to play, and the role of green infrastructure, which I think has become quite a fashionable term, but is really just a sort of codification of something we've probably known for a long time, which is that nature is a very important stakeholder in the human world, and that we need to look after it, and then we need to channel nature to help us as we fight climate change. So I think those are two examples of digital tools. There are many more, but that are helping us in terms of thinking about resilience.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, there's lots around digital twin, around planning, but one of the key pieces is how do you get through to the operations of cities, and how do you connect the infrastructure and the city to the citizens, so that the use of digital on that is really increasing that connectivity. Is also creating some revenue streams for our cities, which is also useful, but the experience of operations within the city is certainly digitally enabled, is assisting. Michelle, maybe coming to you, climate risks are increasing in cities worldwide. There's various impact measures being applied. How do we take those measures and make sure that they apply all the way into the future and make them reasonable?
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to join the panel. And before I get to your question, I would just like to quickly give a background on how we work as KfW Development Bank. So we are part of the KfW group, and we are basically the bilateral German development bank working on behalf of the German government in emerging and developing economies. And we are one of the key instruments of the German government to fulfill the German international climate goals. Now, regarding your question, we see a dangerous convergence of current urban development patterns, so the way cities grow, how they are managed, how they are planned, and multiple climate hazards that are leading to higher and rising risk levels in the cities. So we have all been following the increasing losses and damages from extreme weather conditions all over the world, coming from floods, coming from heat, coming from storm. So to ensure that we finance measures of high impact in this environment of climate change, and that we apply innovative and transformative solutions, we try to systematically address these development dynamics in the high-risk environment of cities. So we have a holistic approach with multi-sectoral concepts for high urban climate resilience in urban areas, and we are increasingly looking into integrating these in our portfolio. So when we are planning programs and projects with our partners, there's a clear focus on including these elements into the project concepts.
And then just a follow on, is there, in terms of the developed and developing world, and what we're seeing is these resilience issues and climate challenges are hitting everybody. Is there a different views in terms of how you approach even those cities, or is there greater challenges on the financing within certain geographies and as you're looking at it?
Well, the way we are approaching our work in cities is, as I was mentioning, sort of looking at all the components that are relevant, not looking at, individual infrastructure measures that a city might need, but really having an overall concept, taking all elements that are relevant to reduce climate risks into consideration. And then from the financing need, there, of course, is an increase in the financing need, taking this holistic approach and also planning all the elements together and at the same time, so that they can sort of jointly have the necessary effect in reducing the climate risk developments.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing also from working with other development banks is the gap between the city's capacity and capability, and then the needs of the financing institutions. And I think that is quite a challenge that we're seeing, in that cities, maybe smaller cities or developing cities, don't necessarily have the skills to be able to put together the projects which can give a bankable, they'll give you then the certainty to be able to lend. So how are you kind of dealing that?
Yeah. Well, we see our work as not sort of exclusively providing financing. So we work very close with our partners, and we start off by analyzing not only the conditions in the city and the sort of projects that we want to finance, but we also look at the partner, and we try to identify where does the partner need strengthening, what is know-how that they need to build up in order to actually adequately plan, implement, and then sustain what we're supporting them in financing.
Super, thank you. I'm going to take a bit of a leap and come back to you, Sam, and looking at as we look at the transition to sustainability, it is really vital that equity is included in there, and that nobody's left behind. How have you in California worked to ensure that the equity to all citizens has been included in your sustainability plans?
So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, so that's one other layer, very important issue that you have to take into consideration. And you don't have to go to compare a developing country to a developed country to see the stark difference. You can see that in one of the richest states anywhere in the world, California, the 5th largest economy, but it is a diverse land. So you have extreme conditions of inequities in California. You have very incredibly wealthy counties, and they're very, very poor counties that don't have the resources to really address a lot of these climate transition issues, from jobs to health, clean air impacts disproportionately areas in California that have less resources. So I think the state has been a leader in taking that as one of the key criteria in all of our policies, and more importantly, all of our investments and programs. So first, we use data to help inform how we direct our policies, but also our investments. Cal Heat Index, GIS-based data that really maps out where the extreme heat conditions are, combined with another GIS mapping, vulnerable communities map, that combined tells us where we need to target our policies and our funding, because that combination tells you where the worst impacts are from an equity perspective. that then helps inform legislation and grant programs and criteria for our grant programs. For example, one of the most successful programs that we have, the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. Abby Edwards is here, my staff, who leads that program. Equity is central in all of the grant programs. So we target our criteria, and to be able to be selected for the grants, you have to meet significant criteria around what impact does your proposal have on the most vulnerable communities in those neighborhoods. That's one. Two, in that process, that you have to have significant and meaningful engagement in the solutions that you're proposing for infrastructure, for resiliency, for adaptations, to be able to access those funds. What that means is the communities most impacted are actually not only at the planning table, they're also at the decision table. Government can go so far in terms of laying out the infrastructure, the resources. What we've learned again and again are the solutions are even more socially sustainable if you engage the communities that are most impacted to be able to shape the outcome and the results. And we've had a number of successful programs that were piloted in my office, now have been scaled up by the federal government. The Biden-Harris infrastructure bill that passed, historic bill, actually incorporated some of those ideas and put almost $2.9 billion to actually target very specifically vulnerable communities to have access to infrastructure dollars that address climate inequity. But California has been a leader on this for quite a long time.
I'd like to add to that just that from our experience when we are planning urban projects, sort of the key to success is to bring all the stakeholders to the table. So all stakeholder groups that in any way are affected by the investments that are foreseen, to have them bring in their perspective, to have them bring in their worries, to have them bring in their needs, and to take that into account in the process of planning and implementation, and also in the sustainable management thereafter.
Yeah, we did work. The Economist Impact Group launched a report last year with us around infrastructure for good, and what the basis was the evaluation of various countries that looked at how do you assess which infrastructure projects you prioritize, and and it was looking at whether ESG and its widest and sustainability was included in that prioritization. And I think one of the interesting stats that came out, that even the best country, and I think Canada came out number one, was at less than 70% of a score, so 70 out of 100, which is fine, but not great. So it just shows that even the best had significant way to go. And so, leaving nobody behind, and that equity piece, as while decarbonization is very important, there are other elements that need to be included in that assessment. And it is fantastic, what you set out there from a California point of view. But if we don't have that right up and center from an infrastructure decision point of view, we are, the wrong results will end up if it's purely economic. And that is one of the things that we're trying to encourage across the globe as we talk about infrastructure projects. I'm going to move to the existing stock. So government and cities are the significant portion of built environment in the world. And if you look at from a sustainability perspective, both the building of those, that's one bit, but the operation of those buildings has a carbon effect. If you look at that existing stock, how are people looking at the decarbonization of that, Lane, and then what can be done to solve that?
That is an excellent question, and there is a lot happening. So I guess from a city, a municipality point of view, the first place that they often start is with their own buildings and their own building stock, and most cities have a significant amount of public buildings that they're responsible for. both kind of commercial buildings and also social housing, residential buildings. And I would say many cities have programs existing in place where they are retrofitting their own building stock. And there are programs available of sort of match funding and financing available from entities like the EIB, for example, that will help them do that. In Europe, every country is obliged to have a national retrofit plan, which encompasses public social housing, and there is quite a bit of new regulation coming in the European Union around the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which will oblige member states and national governments to prioritise the retrofit of their own building stock. So I think their own building stock is something that it's clearly a big task and it will cost a lot of money, but it's in some ways an easy way in. The more difficult task is to then figure out how to incentivize everyone else to retrofit their buildings. And I would say in the commercial sector in particular, so I think in terms of what the public sector can do, it is really around policy and standards. And so, for example, one thing is to make sure that existing building regulations don't stand in the way. And so recently, to take an example in Ireland, there was a fire regulation which obliged building owners to have alternative means of access, and that meant even buildings under 3 stories, 4 stories would have needed a fire exit or a set of stairs, an emergency set of stairs, which is obviously prohibitively costly then in terms of retrofitting, particularly buildings above shops. So we have an issue, I guess, in city centres in particular, and particularly around heritage buildings, about how you bring those buildings back into use. So one thing that the Irish government has done is relaxed that particular regulation, and there is no automatic need to have a set of fire stairs provided as part of the renovation of any building under 4 stories. So that is one thing, and that's just an example of where building regulations stand in the way of renovation and retrofit. Another example from Singapore is about district cooling, and I guess the same would apply to district heating. Again, particularly for city centres, we need to encourage more, often district heating systems are the most efficient way of decarbonising heat in city centres in particular, where it may not be possible to put in, many heat pumps. But how do you get developers and building owners to actually connect to those systems? And that is a challenge that I think many city governments face. So, and in order to be economic, there needs to be a certain volume of buildings connecting to the system. So in Singapore, they have just brought in new regulations which allow for developers to get more gross floor area, so to have more space, if they commit to connecting to the district cooling system in their area. So that could mean they could even get like a whole extra floor on a building for making that commitment. They're also looking at then that also frees up space on the roof for potentially more solar, and then that allows you potentially to have a microgrid which you can then run the electric vehicles off, and that provides for both feed-in, for revenue stream both in the feed-in tariff and perhaps also in the charging of the electric vehicle. So I think thinking of creative ways for building owners and developers to get extra revenue streams or get create extra assets is one way that city governments can seek to be a bit more creative about how they enable the private sector to comply and give them a business case to do that. And then just to finish, I think another and then there's also the stick. So that was the carrot. The stick is, you will know this example from New York. So the New York has brought in the NYC Local Law 97, which I think is quite a pioneering law globally, and that's just coming into force in 2024. And what that does is it places a carbon cap on individual buildings. So buildings larger than 25,000 square feet, that's about 50,000 properties in New York, and they face a carbon cap, and that will actually drive down to net zero by 2050 as the grid becomes cleaner and uses more clean sources of power. So I think there's a few examples there of how government can try to encourage private sector involvement in decarbonisation of buildings and retrofit.
Thanks, Lane. Sam,
yeah,
I was going to come to you anyway.
Well, I just as a son, yeah. I think those have been some of the effective ways of changing the culture in terms of private development. I think Chicago did it even more in the mid-2000s. 2 parts. City actually retrofitted its famous City Hall building, putting green roofs and quantifying it within a year in terms of its economic values. The heating bill was significantly lower, and said, hey, we have the example here. Now we require buildings in the private sector to retrofit existing buildings to build green roofs and relax a lot of regulation, as well as created zoning incentives. Literally within 2 years, a very small 11 by 17 regulation that was written within 2 months transformed that city. In 2 years, that city had more green roofs than the entire US cities combined. That actually revolution was a paradigm change that then brought, from the mid-2000s. So there are things that could be done that are transformative, and they don't have to be very big. Small acts like that are also transformative.
Thanks, Sam. And I think that's a key point. The challenge is a lot of what has to be done is quite piecemeal, and the market isn't always as set up to take the building and do all the that needs to be done. And so there's lots of great examples, but the scale of it makes building an industry out of it challenging. And I guess one of the opportunities for cities and particularly public sector within those cities is to be the leader in the market and has enough of a building stock to drive the demand, create a sector, create an industry that then is available then for the commercial sector and the private sector. So it's that organization and even knowing what to do, because there's lots of various elements into it. And so, Michelle, I'll just come to you. So it does all have to be paid for, in terms of, we just talked about the retrofit, but retrofit versus new, does KFW, are you seeing differences in the views on financing and how, what's interesting, what's no-go, what's potential?
I think the answer to this is that we have to look at each individual project, program, city, and find out what the sort of basic situation is and what the best solution for this situation is. So we have a large portfolio in the area of urban development. In the last 4 years, we committed approximately 14 billion euros for this area. And we still have both approaches. So there are some situations where retrofitting is actually a good solution. For example, in the water sector, where losses from old or damaged infrastructure can lead to further increase in water shortages, but the investment to sort of fix these leakages is much more efficient and much more goal reaching than actually establishing completely new infrastructure or setting up a completely new infrastructure. So yes, we think both approaches have their right of existence, and it depends on the context. What is the right solution?
I think that's one of the critical issues, I think, and is current as well, in terms of looking at the pros and cons of retrofitting, not only from a climate decarbonization perspective, but of course from the economy. So as you know, post-COVID, most cities are still coming out of the vacant office spaces and what to do with them. And the poster child for that are San Francisco and Seattle. Both of them immediately started tackling, how do we address these empty spaces to actually retrofit them for residential, which is a significant need. And I don't think we've cracked the nut yet, and it still needs a lot of work to see where the sweet spots are. So San Francisco did analysis of with the ULI Urban Land Institute, all of the city stock, and then identified which buildings are more conducive to retrofit because of their floor plans. And still, it's very expensive. State of California, we've been encouraging that. So what we did in the last couple of years is look at our own buildings, and as pilots, we're actually retrofitting a couple of them to residential buildings. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, working between government and private sector to really figure out where the sweet spots are. I mean, there's no question that reusing an existing building is one of the most decarbonization acts or green acts you could make, but you really need to figure out where the sweet spots are in terms of the economics of that.
Great, thanks, Sam. I think just timing-wise, we might close with, if you had the magic wand and you could do one thing in an urban space or an urban area or your city, what would that be? What would your magic wand be used for? I'll start with you first, Michelle.
Well, I've seen in the course of the years many urban areas where spaces that were existing were not used, and where the population was not able, to have spaces where the people could come together, where the communities can meet, where social life can take place. So if I had a magic wand, I think for the sake of the next generation, I would have all the relevant actors be more prominently aware of the importance of this.
I think, one of the themes of the conference that I've noticed is this emphasis on nature, and certainly in our work we are seeing a lot more awareness of nature. So I think I would make every city have a plan for bringing nature in, and I would want to see every single infrastructure intervention, whether that be an active travel lane or a new bridge or a new building, include nature in some way. In terms of, to improve people's health and just makes the city a bit more joyous, I think, as well.
If I had a magic wand, I would sort of get rid of money as a factor, then let loose creative minds to really address these issues. But even joking, but even saying that, I think some of the most significant challenges in urban development have always in history been the ones that actually catalyzed true and long-term transformation in every city. The Great Fire of London created significant transformation in the built environment. The Chicago Fire, the same thing, invented the elevator, the high-rise. So I think we are at those moments, post-COVID and extreme climate change, incredible opportunities to actually have transformative, creative ideas to change how the built environment is built, designed, and implemented. So if money was not an issue and you could let loose a lot of creative minds, I think the next transformation can happen much faster than we want.
That's a great message to finish on, because I think you have an opportunity here. There is significant investment to happen. there is a drive towards that sustainable future from citizens everywhere. And here we have an opportunity here to invest in our cities, look at them with a long-term future, but considering that entire fabric of the city and all of the citizens, don't leave anyone behind view in terms of how we deliver that. So, as we plan, and one of the things we drive our clients to do is look at that sustainable approach and that ESG approach from a what should you be building, how should you build it, and who you're delivering to and how you operate it. And with that view in mind, I think there's a positive future ahead. It's everybody that's here. It's in our responsibility and opportunity to do that. But there is a huge opportunity to deliver that, and I think it'll be great for the future. So. Thank you all. Thank you to my panelists. It's a great discussion. Thank you all for coming, and really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of Infrastructure and Transport Day.